Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for this invitation, and I look forward to learning from the conversation. I apologize for my voice. I may sound bear-like or something like that, but I think it's actually a frog that took up residence in my throat. But I'll get over it. You know, there has been a little cold weather here recently in Boston. I would like to ask folks to turn on their screens. It's really helpful to see the faces of the people with whom you're speaking. It, yeah, the little black rectangles are not very good representations of human beings, and so hopefully we can have that kind of conversation. Um, so I guess is this good morning, good afternoon, good evening? I mean,
Yes, it's a very global audience.
yeah, I'm just curious. From Europe, could you raise hands if you're from Europe?
Um,
Digital hand. Let me just see. I want to get a sense of who's here.
there's
Uh,
Lisa.
and I know Europe's a big, term. Latin America. Am I from Latin America, including Mexico, Canada? Um, let's see, Africa, uh, India.
I think Sunil is gone. There are several people from India, but I don't see them in the room right now.
Um,
It's
East
not a good
Asia.
time for them. You realize it's now at middle of the night for them.
I know in South Asia, Pakistan, or uh, I know in China, Japan, anybody from Australia. So let me just see. So most of the folks are from North America. Is that right here? I just want to get a sense of that. Um, okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity. And I think what what seemed to make sense to do. And again, I do want to make a request for people to turn on their screens. I really like to see who I'm talking to. And I think we've been given the gift of sight, and it's pretty good to use it. We had faces before we had words, and so it's a helpful form of communication. Um, I think what I thought perhaps one way to begin would be to share the framework that we've developed for engaging people in leadership, in organizing, and action, and then open things up so we can have a conversation about it, questions, and so forth. The basic approach that we've developed is rooted in these three words of people, power, and change. Engaging with people for the change they need uh, to develop the power they need to achieve that change. Next slide. Now, we also frame this as the challenge of leadership. You know, I found when I was working on my PhD in sociology that you could try to understand social movements without understanding leadership. Didn't make any sense to me. My experience in civil rights movement, the farm workers movement, electoral politics, is that leadership matters a whole lot, especially when you're trying to deal with uncertainty, unpredictable world. You're trying to be imaginative and creative, and it sort of takes agency out of the picture. In fact, I was inspired to do my dissertation in response to it had been part of the social movement canon, Insurgency of the Powerless by Jenkins and Perot, in which they reported on the farm worker movement that I was part of in California and promptly demonstrated that it had nothing to do with us, that it was all the opportunity structure that was appropriate. And that's why it happened. It kind of pissed me off. So I decided I would take that on. And my first published piece was called Resources and Resourcefulness, to try to bring agency back into the picture and creativity and what it is we do to make of the conditions that we find ourselves in, rather than simply describing those conditions. So when it comes to organizing, I think of it as a form of leadership. But I want to define what I mean by that because it's a term that covers many, many sins. For me, the best way of grounding it for me has been in these three questions posed by the first century Jerusalem scholar Rabbi Hillel, who, when asked, "How do I figure out what to do with my life?" responded with three questions to ask yourself. The first, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Not a selfish question, but a self-regarding question. In other words, if I presume to engage with others, I need to approach with enough self-awareness, clarity about my values, my intentions, my purposes, to actually be able to see others as more than a reflection of myself. But the second question he says to ask yourself is, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Recognition that if we are to be thought of as human beings and not things, we recognize that we are relational creatures. We exist in relationship. We make meaning in relationship, and our capacity to realize our objectives is inextricably wrapped up with the capacity of others to realize theirs. And finally, he says, ask yourself, if not now, when? Uh, Not advice to jump into moving traffic, but a caution against what Jane Addams described as the snare of preparation. Let's just have another year of strategic planning. We'll have the perfect plan. Then we will implement, and then the world will totally conform to our expectations. Now, that's never happened to me. I don't know, it may have happened to you. But the point is that rarely can we learn to do what we want to do well without beginning to do it. In other words, that understanding flows from action. It doesn't precede it. It's a generative process. So for me, leadership is about the interaction of these three elements of self with other with action. Now, it also is the case that if you ask, when does leadership matter? You may have had experiences when you've been on a project with others and it's going well. And so there's a whole line of people at your office saying, we just want to thank the folks leading this because you've been doing such a great job. Or is it more often the case that that line forms when, hey, what's going on here? We don't know who decided that. The fact of the matter is that it's the second, not the first, when leadership matters, because it's about when the system's working fine, what do you need leadership for? It's the challenges, the dilemmas, the contradictions, the unexpected, the failures. That's when the initiative taking, creative, adaptive practices of leadership is required. Now that can be challenging because next slide, because it confronts you with, well, do I have the skills to deal with these new challenges? And that's a challenge to the hands. What about my resource? Can I use my resources in new ways? That's a strategic challenge to the head. And then there's, where do I get the hope? Where do I get the courage? How do I inspire the hope and courage in others to take the risks that are often involved in dealing with real challenges? And that's a challenge to the heart. So it's a way of thinking of leadership as a head, hands, heart project that involves all three dimensions. Now, so the definition that I've come to learn, that I've learned to use, next slide, is that leadership is about accepting responsibility, choice, for enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty. In other words, it's thinking of leadership as a practice, not a position or a personality, as something we do. And in that sense, I don't think I have to look too far for examples of people who occupy positions of formal leadership, but turn out to be pretty awful leaders. I don't know if any examples come to mind. On the other hand, we We meet people in the work that I've been doing in neighborhoods, in communities, in workplaces, in kitchen tables, who are doing this work without the titles, without the degrees and designations. They're the people come to for support in figuring out how to work together to achieve purposes they share. Now, organizing, which is the way I was introduced to leadership, focuses on three questions. Next slide. The first question is, who are my people? Not what is my issue. Who are my people? With whom am I engaging in this relationship to work together to achieve a shared purpose? And it's not a trivial question. We're so used to putting people in categories and in labels and in boxes that we don't take seriously the question, who are my people? Which is a question that has to be taken seriously if we're to engage seriously in change. You know, here at the Kennedy School, after the presidential election, they have a thing where they bring together the campaign management of both campaigns. So I spent a day and a half in the same room with the Trump people and the Harris people, which was a pretty interesting experience in and of itself. But it was so clear to me that the Harris campaign had been trying to tell people how they ought to feel rather than listening to how they felt. That is a crucial problem. We are so used to using proxies for people, symbols, data points, and so forth, that we miss the point. Wait a second, these are human beings. We're full human beings. We're not data points. The Harris campaign also, New York Times sent a reporter with an organizer in Wisconsin to go door to door after Kamala was nominated. And they come to a house, a woman comes out. Organizer says, "Hi, I'm working with the Harris campaign. You must be very concerned about choice." Well, education. He starts running down a list. How do I categorize this person? Because by categorizing this person, then we know what sort of stimulus response message to send to them. That has nothing to do with people. At best, it's marketing. And so this question of who are my people really matters. A campaign that took this seriously was Zoran Mamdani's campaign in New York, which took it seriously and actually engaged with learning, with conversation, and with discerning what was on people's minds and their hearts. What would change look like if it could happen? And so that's sort of this second dimension. And so we think of working with people, as next slide, as working with constituents. Not clients, not customers, not data points, but the word comes from the Latin constare, which means to stand together. The idea being to bring people together, to stand together, learn together, decide together, act together, and hopefully to win together. And this is, it's really related very much to Tocqueville's idea of what was so critical for American democracy in the early years was association. Because by bringing people together that we can learn, that we can move out of our individual interests to collective interests. And so that's more the spirit in which this notion, it's treating benefactor and beneficiary as the same people. In other words, it's not, I'm helping out these poor people. It's like we're engaging in developing our own capacities to address the challenges that we face. And so finally, the third dimension, next slide. Next slide. Oh, yeah, that one. Thank you. It's about power. And I think this is one of the most commonly misunderstood concepts. If you need what I've got more than I need what you've got, who's got the power? Point to me or point to yourselves. You need what I've got more than I need what you've got. Who's got the power? I'm looking, I see Margaret's finger. Oh, I see Frank's finger. Okay, good. And if it's reversed, then who's got the power? Then who's got it? See, in other words, power is not something you have. It's an influence that's created by the terms of interdependence. We live in an interdependent world. We're interdependent with people, institutions, so many things. And the question is, what are those terms of interdependence, of the balance of needs and resources? Now, if they're more or less complementary or they're more or less balanced, then we can create a lot of power by collaborating with one another. And that way we can create more influence to affect the world around us. But when it's out of whack, and there's most of the resources are here, most of the resources are here, and most of the needs are here, you got a problem because almost inevitably it will turn into a form of domination. And so then the question you have to ask is, how do we shift this? Because if we don't shift this, we're stuck where we are. Now, one of the real inspirations for me in dealing with this was the Montgomery bus boycott, which really initiated the modern civil rights movement. People have heard of Rosa Parks because people were taking on a system of segregated buses that was a daily pain, it was a daily hurt. And so we say, well, gee, what resources could, there was a citizens council, there was a city council, there was the bus company. I mean, how could poor people possibly take this on? Well, it turns out that they did have resources which could be a source of power. Now, what resources am I talking about? Well, it turned out that everybody had feet. Now, if they use their feet to walk to work and deny the bus company's bus fare, instead of using their feet to get on the bus and give the bus company the bus fare, their individual dependency on the bus company could be transformed into the bus company's dependency on an organized community. And that really is where organizing is, how to turn resources we have into the power we need. So when we look at problems of inequality and all the rest, we start by asking what resources are here? Not, hey, everybody's a big deficit, so we got to take care of them, we got to protect them. That's not really how it works when it comes to change. And so it's more of a question, how do we build the capacity from what we have? And, this was, of course, one of Gandhi's great insights that all systems of oppression depend to some extent on the consent of the oppressed. That you can always say no. It may be costly, very costly, but our agency is not taken away from us unless we cede it, unless we give it. Or the way he put it, our obedience is not given, is not required unless we give it, or our self-respect. So it's a very important way of thinking about power because it opens up, when I was working with the farm workers, it was 5 years to boycott grapes. It took 5 years. But we figured out how to turn grapes into a source of power. The American colonists turned out how to turn tea into a source of power. So it's trying to be imaginative and not getting stuck into Goliath's definition of power when we're much more in the position of David and have to find within our resources a ways to deal with that. Now, let me just share this next slide, which is a quote. And I'm sorry, back one, go back. Yes, one more. Yeah, that. Oh, no, that one. Yeah, that one there. I want to ask someone if they would read this. I became a fan of Pope Francis because I thought that his orientation, he moved from, what happened? Everybody just shifted away. Are you still there?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay. Something happened on my computer. Wait, it's happening again. Stop. Okay. I don't know. The computer gods are mad. I don't know. Not proper respect. Anyway, wait, it keeps happening. Okay.
So I can read it for you if you'd like. We
Yeah,
can.
please do. Please do. I just wanted to say this is in Fratelli Tutti, which was the second to the last of his encyclicals. And one of the changes he made was to move from Teología de Liberación to Teología del Pueblo. In other words, people's theology, not ideological theology, but grounded in people. Yeah, Yanir, would you mind reading this?
Sure. We are called to love everyone without exception. At the same time, loving an oppressor does not mean allowing him to keep oppressing us or letting him think that what he does is acceptable. On the contrary, true love for an oppressor means seeking ways to make him cease his oppression. It means stripping him of power that he does not know how to use, and that diminishes his own humanity and that of others. Those who suffer injustice have to defend strenuously their own rights and those of their family, precisely because they must preserve the dignity they have received as a loving gift from God.
I think this says a whole lot. And I think it really is very foundational, at least in my experience, for what we do. And so power is to be, Paul Tillich wrote the book Love, Power, and Justice, in which he argued that power without love could never be just, but love without power can never achieve justice. So I think we have to be really clear. My favorite Jesus quote, actually, I seem to be in the theological world here, is from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, where he's about to send his organizers out, called apostles, to tell the new story. And he says, if I am to set you as sheep among wolves, you must be innocent as doves and wise as serpents. It's not either or, it's both and. If we're going to change the world into what it ought to be, we have to confront it as it is. And at the same time, not surrender to the instrumentalizing, the dehumanization that is so much in this world. So I find this helpful. Next slide. Finally, in organizing, we look for three outcomes, not just one. The first is, did we win the campaign? Did we pass the law? Did we achieve that? But the second one is, did we come out of this stronger than we went into it? I don't know if you've ever had the experience of being on a project or a campaign with others, and you may even win, but you never want to see anybody ever again who was involved. I see the laughter. I'm not the only person that happened to. So you have to ask yourself, what are we building? What did we build? Yeah, we won that thing, but what did we build? And that is even a more important question, because if we're going to shift power, it's not this one off and that one off. It's how we're building a strength in our communities, in our organizations, to actually shift power and sustain it. And finally, did we develop more leadership? It's one of the, well, I'll say a bit more about leadership in a bit, but in social movements, and I think in organizing generally, the practice of leadership is so important. And thinking of it as, again, as a practice, not a formal designation. And so if we are running a campaign or a project in such a way that leadership development is built into it, then we have something. Going back to the Montgomery bus boycott for a moment, if the lawyers had desegregated the buses, no community would have been built. That's the problem with Brown v. Board of Education. It has been ever since. The power wasn't built. It was relying on the lawyers simply to do it. And so it and the other thing about the bus boycott was it created a powerful community, but it also generated enormous amounts of leadership. If you look at who was the strategy team, the initial strategy team, you will find Dr. King was not there. It was a leadership team that was very diverse with many different perspectives and experiences that invited Dr. King, because he was a new kid in town, didn't have any baggage, to step up to leadership. Well, what came out of that was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a whole generation of leadership. So these three outcomes, yes, we won, we lost, we are stronger, not weaker, and we have developed more leadership capacity. Next slide. So the way we approach introducing people to the practice of organizing and leadership is through practices, these 5 practices. Now, I don't believe in models. I mean, I think there is a school of thought that all models are wrong, which I agree with, because a model is a snapshot of a dynamic process in a particular moment. We then treat that abstraction, that snapshot, as if it has greater truth value than lived experience. That's a problem because then we start trying to fit people into boxes rather than use frameworks as lenses on complexity to illuminate deeper understanding. My mom was a teacher, and well, she always told me about Procrustes, this Greek pirate king. Whenever they got prisoners, they'd bring them back, and he had this plank. And if you were too short for the plank, you'd be stretched until you fit it. And if you were too long, you'd be chopped until you fit it. Unfortunately, I think this is what we do with our models way too often, trying to fit people into boxes rather than seeing those frameworks, those concepts simply as hypotheses about how the world may work, which may or may not be useful. So that's why we focus on practices, uh, practices that combine values, they combine concepts, and they combine skills. And they require sustained learning. In other words, it's not like we got it all figured out. Uh, you know, General Eisenhower was interviewed after D-Day, and the reporter asked him, "Gee, General Eisenhower, boy, that plan must have really mattered." He said, "Yeah, planning's really important, but plans are useless." The whole point being that once you get into a dialogue with reality, that's when the learning really begins. And so with practices, that's the idea. They are ongoing, sustained ways of engaging ourselves with the world. Now, so these 5 practices that we focus on are all capabilities every human being has. What do you see something called Search iCloud? I think that no, the computer demons are giving me a hard time. All right. Anyway, um, uh, yes. So we start with these practices, and oh, this is annoying. Let me see if I can get rid of it. This is so weird. Ah, okay. Liberated. All right, thank you. Yeah, so now the pedagogy for practices, if you're working in practices, is not that of, it's more like learning to ride a bicycle. Uh, and I imagine most folks here have learned to ride a bicycle. And I imagine it wasn't by studying bicycleology or getting an advanced degree or watching YouTube. It was probably by getting on the bike. And probably the first thing that happened was you fell. And that's your moment of truth. You went home, went to bed, or you found the courage to get back up on that bike, knowing you're going to keep falling for a while to learn to keep your balance. This is how we approach a pedagogy of practice. We explain, we model, we practice, and we debrief. It's rooted in Carol Dweck's understanding of mindset learning, of growth mindset versus fixed mindset. The educational psychologist that sort of says, if we approach learning something new as judgment on whether we are smart or dumb or whatever it is, our defenses kick in. But if we understand critical feedback as data on our learning, information that we need, then we approach it quite differently. So we don't believe in creating safe space for learning. We do believe in creating brave space for learning, where we become sources of courage and interdependent learning for one another in the practice of what we're doing. Now, all of these, as I say, are practices that every human being does. Let me just go to the next slide. Yeah, let me just start with relationships. It's what's a relationship? I imagine everybody's had experience with relationships, not necessarily good all the time, but and let me just share an example of what I mean by this. One of my students will invite another student to have coffee, another student to have coffee. So they have a great conversation, really good. And so one says to the other, let's get together again next week and continue. And the other one says, I got exams next week. What about the next week? I got people coming from out of town. What about the next week? I'll send you an email. Well, sociologically speaking, that person just got dumped. That's what happened. And what happened was that they were not both ready to risk commitment, to risk committing their precious resource of time to each other. So relationships are born from commitment, the risk of making commitments that then can create a future. Because without commitment, see, we live in such a transactional world. Everything's transactions. I don't know, you've probably been at something where some event where you say, "Ooh, I just got networked." They're transactions. They're instrumental. They're extractive. Relationships are not. Relationships are, yeah, I'm going to risk commitment to this other person, this project. And, so trust grows out of commitment. It doesn't precede it because commitment's risky because we can't predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen. And I think so then the question is not only interests and resources we may share, because relationships, sure, you know, two people are identical, don't have much to have a relationship about. There's no learning there. There's no growth. There's nothing happening. They're complementary in terms of interests and resources, but the courage to risk commitment has a lot more to do with the values and what kind of values we experience as shared in this relational work. But it's how we build a future. And because they evolve, they change. It may go from being a tennis partner to being a co-author. I mean, who knows what? That's how we create a future is through relational engagement. Now, the second practice, next slide. I know there's an, yes, it's storytelling. Next slide. And storytelling is actually, it really is a way in which we've evolved in our cultures as a way of equipping ourselves and others to deal with the fact that life is full of uncertainty and that dealing with the unexpected, that for which we're not prepared, is a fundamental challenge. I mean, we know that our earliest rituals were around death because someone was gone. And how do we deal with that? How do we cope with that? So it's really the earliest form of discourse, once we had language, was to start telling stories. And so understanding what stories are really about is really an important element. I mean, they were often sung as well. So an example, I went with my partner to the seashore to see the sunset, and it was beautiful. And it turned orange and it turned pink. That was the first moment. Here's the second moment. I went with my partner to the seashore to see the sunset, and it turned orange and pink. It was really beautiful, and it started to rain. I turned to go, but she grabbed my arm and said, "Wait a second, it's only rain. As long as we're together, we're good." See, something happened in the second moment. Nothing happened in the first moment. The first moment was descriptive. The second moment was a narrative moment. And what made it a narrative moment was there was a disruption, rain. Now, I reacted fearfully. She reaches out to me in love and actually reinforces our relationship. So the moral of the story is that love can overcome fear, all in that moment. See, the moment is the core essence of narrative. That's what it is. It is a moment in which we experience a disruption, and it may become a threat, or we may construe it as a threat, or we may construe it as a challenge. That depends a whole lot on how we encounter it. Do we react to it fearfully, as we're hardwired for, or can we respond to it hopefully? Can we construe it as a challenge, our curiosity provoked, or do we construe it as a threat from which we must flee? Are we confronting it isolated, alone, or in solidarity with others? Are we confronting it as not believing in our own self-efficacy, our own capacity, or we believe in our own self-worth? So this process, this project of narrative, is really how we retain the capacity to exercise agency in the face of disruptions and challenges and so forth. I mean, and the thing is, because we can identify with the protagonist empathetically, we experience the narrative. I bet you felt a little something in my second moment that you didn't feel in the first moment. See, it's understanding that the language of emotion is fundamental to values and understanding and sharing values. That emotions are fundamentally feelings. They're not abstractions. And, we assign our students Antonio Damasio's terrific book on feeling and knowing, which sort of explains how we move from sensing to feeling to knowing, and the fundamental role that emotion plays in understanding the world and ourselves. And we sort of get, get the emotions out of it. Well, yeah, because we're all logical, rational. Well, then we're not humans anymore, because emotional language is a fundamental language. Now, music speaks a language of emotion, theater, worship, poetry, on and on and on. It's how we, and what it is really how we value. We map the world cognitively, but we also map the world affectively. And it's the affective mapping that we turn to when it comes to questions of value. St. Augustine said it's one thing to know the good, another to love it. Loving it is what enables action on it. Knowledge without motivation does not equal action. And so the significance of motivation and the language of emotion is fundamental in this whole work of organizing and change. And the way we've come to learn to share it is by learning how we can tell a story of self, a story that is, use narrative to communicate to others why we've been called, not our title, not our CVs. What are the life experiences we've had in which we learn to care, in which we learn to hope? And a story of us, what are the experiences we can share? Not a category, but experience we share. And a story of now, what is this moment? Is it a threat? Is it a challenge? What kind of choices are we called upon to make in this moment? So that's obviously a whole other thing we can talk about, but it's the part that's often left out. It's sort of imagining people as utility maximizing, machines. I have to say that I was at a dinner at MIT with Tim Berners-Lee, a guy who invented the World Wide Web. And he was saying that machines can make decisions, but only people can make choices. His point was that the AI, the machine operates, the information it accesses in the forms of zeros and ones, and basically it's a calculator device. Now, we access information through our emotions, through our bodies, through our proximity, our experience. So we are equipped for judgment, not just decision making. That's his point. And I think sometimes we really forget about that. And so that's why I'm sort of spending a little time on understanding, speaking the language of emotion. No social movement operates that doesn't. Next slide. Next slide. That was what I was just saying. The third is strategy. Now, this often gets way, way, way overcomplicated. I mean, did anybody have to strategize about anything today? Did anybody oversleep? Did anybody miss the bus? Did anybody, oh, the computer didn't work? See, if you understand, we are purposeful creatures. And so a lot of what we do, a lot of our imagination is in dealing with that which gets in the way of our purposes. And so, oh my God, oh, I missed the bus. What do I have to do? Well, next, what I have to do is, next slide, is figure out how to turn what I have into what I need to get what I want. Basically, that's strategy. And we do it all the time. We're equipped for storytelling, we're equipped for relationships, and we are all natural strategists because we deal with these questions. And I kind of like the origin of the word, next slide, because it comes from Greek. Strata was the word for field. And the army was called strata because it was to claim the field, to hold the field. The general was called the strategos. He goes up on a hill, overlooks the field. He comes up with the theory of change, or he wouldn't have called it that. He would have called it a battle plan. It's a hypothesis that if we deploy people in this way and that, our odds of winning are greater than if we didn't. Now, the ranks of soldiers down in the valley, they were called tacticas. And this is where we get strategy and tactics. Strategy, the theory, the hypothesis. Tactics, the activities through which we test that hypothesis, so to speak. And we get into trouble. I think, is there another slide after this? Yeah, we get into trouble when the cloud comes between the two. And the folks up top, we got the big picture. We see the whole truth. The people down in the valley, we have the context. We have the whole truth. The reality is that neither one has the whole truth. We need each other to be able to contextualize the capacity to actually observe across cases and hypothesize causes and outcomes. So it's a real problem organizationally, I have to say, this one, where we polarize in these two different domains. But the point I really want to make is that strategy is something we all know how to do. Next slide. Oh, yes, it's intentional. What's the slide that comes right after this? Yeah, but that's reality. It's rarely ever linear because strategy is a verb. It's not a noun. It's not something you have. It's something you do. Because unless you are learning from your testing of of a hypothesis through our activities, then we'd go off in space somewhere and the world's over there. So it requires ongoing learning. What's working? What's not working? How do we improve? So it's much more like this than it is a straight line. Next slide. Action. When when I was introduced to organizing, I was told that if you can't count it, it didn't happen. Now, this is not about metrics when a foundation says we want to know your metrics, which is often things they want to count, but happen to be irrelevant to the work that we're actually doing. The way I was schooled in this was that you had to know how many people came to the meeting. You had to know how many were invited. You had to know why the ones who were invited didn't come. You had to know why this person was getting results and that one wasn't. In other words, you had to create metrics for observing the effectiveness of what you're doing. And in that way, you have mechanisms for learning. And so, it's not like, hey, how was it? Oh, the meeting was great. Well, how many people? Well, there were a lot of people. And that's not very helpful. It's getting down to the nitty-gritty of what is actually happening in the world of the result of our actions and activities. So when we say action, that's what we're talking about. Ways in which we act so that we can observe, how many people came to the meeting, how many workers went out on strike, In my case, with the grape boycott they were doing, how many carloads of grapes came into Toronto? I mean, it was trying to be real about the fact we're really trying to change the world. And unless we can observe that, then how do we know what in the world we're doing? And the other point about action is the resources we depend on. Because if we depend on resources that come from somewhere else, it's very different than if we're depending on the resources of our people. A big difference, between people-dependent resources like the bus boycott and resources that are generated by foundations and funders, which sadly often creates dependency rather than agency. And it's one of the big problems in organizing these days is NGOs are not representative organizations. They're nonprofit firms. And they operate just, Elizabeth Anderson at the University of Michigan describes this so well in her work about private governance. They don't foster democracy because democracy is not something you have. It's something you do. It's a practice. And if you're not practicing democracy, what is it? And so that's a major challenge we have. We've been doing a project with the Girl Scouts actually for the last year, which is kind of cool because there are 1.9 million members. They pay dues, support their own organization. They elect their leadership. They practice democracy, and they're equipping young women and girls for leadership in a democratic world. And I don't know if there's any former Girl Scouts here, but there's rarely a group in which I don't say this and somebody says, I was a Girl Scout, AM. I see you got it. See, I learned a whole lot from working with them because that's what their project is. It's not how do I get a grant from this foundation or the other, because then the foundations or the wealthy people become the sources of power, and we're not creating our own. This is challenging. It's often the case in social movements that the people who really have the least wind up having to sacrifice the most, because that's what's required to gain agency. And so we can come back and talk more about that, but I think it's a fundamental challenge. Next slide. Oh, that's about whether we deploy resources in such a way that we're generating more resources or fewer resources. When I was working for the farm workers in New York, we could raise a few $1,000s a day off the streets of Manhattan with a can. And we never went anywhere without a can and a clipboard because everywhere we went, we were looking for new sources of funding and sources of people. And one day I was actually walking the lawn in New York with a sign, boycott lettuce, and I had a cup of coffee and somebody threw a quarter in the cup of coffee because they thought, oh, we had trained them so well. The point is you build in how you generate more, not how you use it up. Grants gone, got to stop. That's not how it builds. Next slide. And finally, how do we structure ourselves? Now, this word can strike fear into the hearts of many. Structure, oh my God, I'm going to be constrained. I'm going to have to do things I don't want to do. Well, we've all had to work under oppressive structures. But structure also comes from the Latin, and it means to build. That's what it means, building. And you build, if you're not building is an act of hope because it's building for the future. That's the only reason it's worth building anything. And so it takes agreeing commitments on how we're going to work together, how we're going to make decisions, how we're going to hold ourselves accountable, how we're going to deal with time. And so many efforts fall apart on this question. I mean, we were doing an intro to organizing for some Harvard faculty last year. The thing they had the hardest time, let's go to the next slide. The thing they had the hardest time was, and let's go one more slide. Yeah, they had the hardest time was with decision making. Well, wait a second, I may not agree with that. We get trapped in this idea that consensus is somehow democratic, when in fact, what consensus does, it elevates the power of individual autonomy over everything else. That's not democratic. It's not collective. If we join a collective, we invest elements of our agency in collective agency. And if we're not prepared to do that, we're not building a collective. Commitments are the other thing. Time, excuse me. We've been working with our students here in sort of as a laboratory in forming values-based teams as opposed to issue-based teams. And it's interesting because the ones who really take this stuff seriously, they may not have a great strategy to begin with, but they evolve one. The ones who fall apart on this, they never get there. And sadly, this is too much where things fall apart. You go back just one other slide. And so one of the core practice, I'm sorry, back one, back one, back one, back. I know we can reverse. I know politically we're trying to go way back. Okay, yeah. The work of developing a shared purpose then becomes critical. And who are our people? What are we trying to achieve? What kinds of activities? And we do this in such a way that people write a full sentence about this, and then we hear where the overlap is. We start by understanding the commonalities. Too often when you get into shared purpose, it's like, well, I think it's trees. Well, I think it's fish. Right away, we're defining ourselves by our differences. The point is to offer ourselves the opportunity to define ourselves in terms we share, and then put the differences in that context. And in that context, take them seriously and deal with them. So this practice of a shared purpose becomes a fundamental piece of work. The class we're doing here right now, last week, we designed our teams for maximum diversity. And I think 10 out of 12 came up with a shared purpose because they were focusing on values they shared, not simple issues. And it's really interesting because it goes deeper. It's about not fish, not trees, but reverence for the natural world. And that's where we need to get. Now, I think we're getting to the end here. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. Coming back to this question of leadership and what we mean by it. You see, that's a dot. Has anybody ever been a dot? Have you ever been a dot? Have you ever tried to work with a dot? I see AM is smiling. You must have, what am I talking about? AM.
We're not items on a list, or like you were describing in Harris's campaign, things that you can market to. We're individuals. We've never been a dot. We're not a dot in a chart.
Well, and when it comes to leadership, have you ever experienced dot leadership? In other words, everything's got to come to one person. And that's the one who holds. I mean, that's the one. Go to the next slide. Because here's what happens. Next slide. The person burns out, and so does everybody else. You know, it's not workable. It's a traditional understanding of leadership that's dead wrong. I mean, you know, it wasn't just Dr. King. I mean, you know, Jesus had a team of 12 and only one went bad, but it wasn't just one person. The prophet had his companions. In other words, it's trying to understand that this notion of one person governing all is very problematic. So sometimes we react to it. Next slide. No, we're not going to have any structure. We're not going to have any, we're leaderless. We're a leaderless group, or we're all leaders. Well, problem with that is the next slide. Yeah, everybody goes off in their own direction. And Joe Freeman, a feminist sociologist, wrote in the 70s a piece she called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, because she was arguing that human structure, they create structure. Either it's transparent and on the books, or it's hidden. And, you know, who decided that? Oh, well, what? Really? You know what I'm talking about. We've been in those kinds of experiences. And if our power depends on our collective effort, boy, we're just shedding power all over the place. And it comes from this problem of thinking of structure as inherently oppressive, rather than as a form of communication and accountability and development. So we began working with a different approach, actually with the Obama campaign in 2007. One of the people on my dissertation committee was Richard Hackman, who was a real guru in organizational behavior, particularly in the development of teams. And we took a lot from that. Let's go to the next slide. And so the typical structure in a political campaign was a precinct leader. Well, at our first Camp Obama, we said, well, let's try something different. We're going to have leadership teams. But they're going to be real teams. They're not going to be fake teams. They're going to be as real as a soccer team, as real as a string quartet, in which it's clear the values the purpose we share. It's clear what our roles are. It's clear our interdependencies. And it really kind of shifted the ground, because then leadership came to be understood as collaborative, as interdependent, not I've got to do everything myself. And so we built leadership teams in that campaign, and people who experienced that experienced being part of something, and sort of something where, I don't know, you may have had experiences going to team meetings. I call them dread meetings, where, oh my God, what horrible thing is going to happen, as opposed to joy meetings where I have a problem, I'm going to get help. Learning interdependence is so powerful. And so we began by forming these kinds of leadership teams. And then we had a scale question. So this is how we dealt with that. Next slide. Turned out each team member could form their own team. And you know what else? Next slide. Each one of those people could build their own. In other words, it became a way we could build leadership into a constituency so that responsibility was actually delegated and shared and accountable. So it was distributed leadership, but distributed in a way that actually worked. And this is not the only way, obviously, to organize leadership. We found it very helpful because it was very generative of people's leadership developing in the course of what they were doing, not in a seminar somewhere where they got leadership training. This in South Carolina, for example, where we were doing the primary for Obama in 2008, Hillary Clinton had the support of all the institutions. So we had to build from scratch. Well, we were trained in this, we could have a one-on-one meeting with a person, but guess what? They knew other people. They could invite those people to their house. Then we could go, and then they could hold meetings. It's kind of like Tupperware. It's called house meetings. We were trained in this, basically. We had 500 of these house meetings, built an organization of 15,000 people, and we won the primary for Obama. And so it's a way of appreciating sort of this kind of approach to where you're grounding it in people themselves. Next slide. And finally, Stephen Jay Gould wrote a book, Time's Arrow, and he's describing two ways of thinking of time. It's rooted in the Greek, the difference between kairos and chronos, but he's talking about time as the time of continuity, time as a cycle. But then there's also time as change, which he calls time as an arrow. In other words, continuity, the annual budget review and so forth. But a campaign is time as an arrow. It's change. It's starting here and ending up over here. And it's intense and it's focused and it is a way of building the resources we need in the course of doing what we need. It's the opposite of waiting for a grant and then starting. It's starting and then generating the resources in the course of that to achieve your goal. Next slide. I think this may be, yeah, that's a visual of really kind of how it works. You have a kickoff, then, gee, we need X number of volunteers, peak one, then we relax. Okay, now we need X number of teams. Okay, now we're there. Okay, now we need to contact X number of voters. Now we're there. Each of these peaks is not just quantitative, it's qualitative. It's a shift in capacity. And it's a way with intentionality building the resources you need to win in the course of the work that you're doing. Next slide. So that's kind of how we approach this with these practices and how they interact with each other in a kind of a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. Next slide. Okay, over to you. I hope I didn't gobble up all the time just now. I was hoping there would be a timekeeper that would tell me, stop. But let's open up here. And I felt like I wanted to offer something as a way we could engage with these questions of how do we actually make this stuff? Oh yeah, there's a new book out published last year called People, Power, and Change. It's available, and you may recognize the author. So I just want to encourage that. That's my commercial. And one other thing, next slide. We're also part of what we call the Leading Change Network, which is a network of organizers, researchers, and educators, really in different parts of the world, who are all learning together how to do this stuff. I was told public narrative, for example, that's an American thing. It'll never work anywhere else. Well, the UK, we tried. No, UK, no, stiff upper lip, never worked. Took about 10 minutes because creating an authorizing space in which we can allow ourselves the vulnerability to be seen turns out to be something very powerful. And then in Jordan, oh no, it'll never work. In the Arabic men, I heard one of the most powerful stories from a guy who was there. He was an environmental activist, and he said he didn't have a story. And he came back the next day and said he found his story. What was his story? He had his father had olive trees, and he loved these olive trees. They were the love of his life. And in the Quran, you spare trees along with innocence because they're a life source. And one day the bulldozers came and they started to tear down the trees. His father fell on his back and he saw a tear in his eye. And he said, that's when I knew I had to save the trees. That's it. Pretty powerful. I was back about 8 years later with a large group, and I was describing this, and way in the back, guy said, that's me, that's my story. So it really opens up ways of connecting around values that narrative opens the way for, that we would think are closed off by the categories and stereotypes that we create. Okay, now over to you.
Thanks. So, Vincent, can you stop the sharing? And then let me ask Adam if he has a question, because if you have one, I would defer to you.
No, thanks. I'll defer to other. I'm just taking it all in. Thank you, Marshall.
Great. Thank you very much, Marshall. It's been very enlightening. Who has a question?
Or
Please.
an argument, or a disagreement, or a critique, or whatever, or an example.
I guess I've got one. I really appreciated what you shared, in particular about rethinking what is leadership. Can't we all really take leadership if we decide to think about something and someone else and care about them, and then and I loved your idea of teams building teams, and I really agree that we us having contact with each other is so important. And I'm a retired attorney. When you're trying a case in court, you're telling a story.
That's right.
You're meeting the requirements of the law. You're proving facts, but it's that narrative thread. And sometimes the spaces you leave in your tale are as important as what you say. And I saw someone else put in the chat about communicating about, for example, SARS-CoV-2 and airborne transmission. And I think story is just so, it just matters. Everybody has one. And so I think for organizing and getting stuff done, it's important. I also really liked what you said about constituencies and finding there are commonalities, but there are also commonalities, sadly, if you're in the constituency of a worker in this country who doesn't have what my former clients would call good papers, well, you're in a constituency whether you want to be or not. So anyway, I'm just kind of randomly thinking, but in particular, what did you find and what did your organizers find what was effective? How building a good team? I understood you to say we try something and then we come back and we break down what we learned. But do you know what I mean? I love that diagram of you had a core team. And it seems to me when you're forming that core team, you're wanting people who know how to back other people and think about them to build, to encourage them to lead and build their teams.
Yes.
So I'm just kind of wondering if you could say a little more about how that worked.
Oh, well, it wasn't perfect because that's not of this life. On the other hand, it's a question then, as you just said, about learning. And wait, something's here where I'm seeing a big me, but I'm not seeing everybody.
That's okay. You're spotlighted right now, but I can remove it. Yes.
Can we not spotlight? Oh, great. Oh, that's much better. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, there's a couple of things here. There's a lot of things that pass for training. I mean, they call it training. I think of it, it's more educating. It's the educare. It's drawing out. My mom was a teacher. She called herself an educator because the Latin educare is to draw out. It's not to fill people's heads with facts or would-be facts. It's about seeing each human being as capable of development and growth. And so when we do training, that's just like trying a script. We're missing the point. I think in the church, the term they use is formation. I think it's much better because it's cultural. It has to do with values, how we interact with one another, and how we learn together. And so that's one sort of foundation. We just did a project in Portland, Oregon, and in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in which
Yay, I live in Portland. Thank you. Sorry.
uh,
I just
yeah,
got excited.
Sandy Chung, who runs the ACLU there, brought together about 80 people. And we worked with them for 2 days. We have some data on this I'm happy to share of people coming angry, isolated, defensive, but discovering in each other the sources of their strength and left much more hopeful. And it wasn't just like, flowers in May. These were people who had been active, had been to trainings, but they hadn't built the relationships with one another to actually see each other, that was their source of creativity. And that's how they were going to move forward. So I'm happy if you send me an email, I'll be happy to share the data we put together on this because we wanted to see really what the effect of it was. So that's one thing, is about investing seriously in equipping people with the understanding of the practices. But then, this may sound like a crazy small thing. At the end of every class we teach, every training, we do what we call pluses, deltas, and takeaways. And a takeaway is, okay, what did we just learn? And in experiential learning, it's especially important because if the learning isn't articulated, a lot of the value of the experience is lost. And so it's an effort to articulate, to put into words, so that something that can be a resource, something that can be an influence on us can become a resource for us. It's about cultivating agency. And the pluses and deltas are what facilitated your learning, what worked. And then the deltas, they're not minuses, they're deltas. What do we need to improve? What can we do better? And we just build that into everything. And so it's a small way of just institutionalizing, so to speak. We are learning all the time. And the world is never a closed book, and we never have all the answers. And I think that's another piece of this. But it takes the one other thing I didn't mention is coaching. The first thing we teach everyone is coaching. And by coaching, there's terrible coaching like do this, don't do that. Skilled coaching is really, it's not about giving advice, it's about asking questions. And that's how we teach people to coach. Your job is to help this other person break through what they're stuck with. But you can only do it by asking questions. You cannot give any advice. At first, people are silent, and then they realize the power of being an interlocutor and that we all exist in the water of, we're all fish in the water of our own experience. And having a person who is not trying to use us, but is interested, asking us those kinds of why questions. What about this? Boy, it surfaces so much that we know that we don't even realize that we know. And so that kind of coaching, we build that into everything because it's a way of building interdependent learning. We did an experiment with the NHS in the UK of senior civil servants and junior civil servants. We're going to teach you to coach each other. That'll never work. That'll never work. Turns out the older ones were scared of the young ones were scared of the older ones. But put together, they turned out to be really generative sources of learning for both of them. So it's trying to create an interdependent learning context, not one where there's the knower and then the receiver. It's much more of a collaborative kind of development. I hope that's a start on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So everybody has coaches, and we build coaching into just a regular part of we have a meeting. Okay, who needs coaching? Let's coach each other.
Let's try to do two more. Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This was excellent. I'm struck by how leadership or good leadership has been corrupted over time. So if you look at Mary Parker Follett and not doing to or doing for, but doing with.
She had it exactly right.
And a servant leadership model. But yet you take these leadership courses and at no time do you learn about servant leadership. They don't like that word. And if you look at the book by Larry Collins about good to great, he said it. You don't know the name of the great company, the name of the CEO, because it was never about them. It was about building a sustainable company. And it was about the team, but it was never about the individual. But here we are. We remember Jack Welch. We remember, Steve Jobs, all these, what society has put forward as the model of great leaders.
Well, it's no accident, is it? In other words, it's like we're projecting. It's sort of like, hey, I've gotten to where I am, and I did it in this way, and I'm the greatest of the great. And so if you want to be great like me, then you need to be like me. I mean, it's sort of like, look, in a school like this one, there's so much of that. Find the exceptional people, give them exceptional opportunities. Then there will be exceptional leaders. My God, I actually find more affinity with people who do leadership development at West Point because they're actually combining what they call be, know, do. Who are, what are you, your values? What do you need to know and what do you need to be able to do? And how you delegate that out so that it doesn't all congeal here at the top. I thought I'd never say that, but I mean, I'm really, we're learning where that is. But yeah, we have these corporate models. They dominate so much. They dominate the academy for sure, as well as, the world of corporate. And so it's got to be challenged. And see, I find, in my classes, well, first of all, we do online as well as offline classes. In our online classes, it's all practitioners. In our in-person classes, it's students here. But a lot of them are mid-careers. They're people who've been out in the world. And they, how can I say, they kind of get this in a way. We have refugees from Goldman Sachs. We have refugees from law firms. We have refugees from where they drank the Kool-Aid because so many universities are in cahoots with these firms that come and try to recruit people. And it's like, oh, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a consultant. See, we got to step up to this in cultivating a different understanding of leadership. And so in my classes, there's a lot of people like that. The classes also tend to be 2/3 women, which is also not an accident. Because the global women's movement, I think, is one of the most important sources of generative change. And we've seen it here, we've seen it in the Middle East, we've seen it everywhere. But yeah, it's not, how can I say, it's not innocent what you're describing. It has to be challenged.
Can I just squeeze in another? What about First Nation learning? Because it seems like they had it right and we destroyed a lot of their way of knowing, like embedding, the next generation in any decision and leave it better than you found it or as good as you found it, right?
Well, as a side comment here, a colleague and I teach, so I've been teaching here. I mean, I was an organizer for like 28 years and then came back and finished my senior year and graduated here in 90. I was class of 64-92, and then did a PhD in sociology and then was asked to teach. And the teaching was a way I could integrate my life experience in the social science in a pedagogical conversation with a rising generation. And so it's kind of been a blessing to get to go to class twice a week and have a conversation with the future, which is really kind of what it is. And so I've been particularly impressed with that source of energy throughout the world. And it's really an important. So would you just repeat the last question you asked to pertain?
I was just saying the indigenous
Yeah,
way of
yeah,
knowing.
yeah. We, with a colleague, Chris Robichaux, who's a philosopher, we designed a new class that we called Being Human. And we tried it out as an experiment 3 years ago with 20 students. Then we taught it as a 4-credit class, as a J-term class, like in January. And we had 45 students. This year, we just finished, we had 94 students. And they're from everywhere. And this question, what is it to actually value our humanity? We're not machines, we're not AIs, we're humans. And so we just did a presentation on this class this morning for some of the people we work with, because boy, we've been learning so much from that about getting down to the business of the core. What are our sources of value? How do we communicate? How do we value others, and how do we devalue others? How do we dehumanize? And how do the institutions we build dehumanize? So that's kind of, I think, related to the question you're asking.
Yeah.
For me, it was kind of a discovery that sorry. It's kind of a discovery that that's kind of been underneath all the stuff I've been doing. I mean, in Mississippi, where I was introduced to organizing, I learned that the strategy and tactics were important, but it was the people that mattered most. And it was working with people to enable them to find their sources of courage, their sources of voice, the power of the church, the power of song, all these ways of strengthening one another was kind of what I took away from that experience. And similarly with the farm workers. So it's sort of coming back around to something that I just think is so fundamental.
Thank you.
Adam, would you like to close up?
Well, I'm conscious that we're over time, so maybe I'll send Marshall an email.
Okay. Marshall, I really want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your understanding and wisdom with us. And I'm looking forward. I hope that there will be more opportunities for us to
So,
engage with you. There is much, of course, that we are doing that can benefit tremendously from your understanding.
and I think our understanding can benefit from what you're doing because that is how it works. And I would ask people if they would put in the chat a takeaway, a plus, and a delta. And then if you'd be so kind as to send me the chat after we do this. AI has its value. Definitely. I love ChatGPT, by the way, for philosophical argument. But I don't think it's a person. I think it's a machine. Anyway, please, I'd appreciate that very much. And look forward to ways in which we can connect in the future. I have an email. You can send emails. The Leading Change Network. And of course, there's this wonderful book that you can share. So take care. And really, thank you for this opportunity. I wish we'd had more time for conversation, but I'm addicted to long answers. So take care.